Live on YouTube now.
السلام عليكم.
السلام عليكم دكتور هاني.
حياكم الله، شو الأخبار؟
الحمد لله, الله يخليك. Welcome. We have here all our three speakers with Dr. Lisa Tang, also from GaBI, who's thankfully accepted our invitation. Okay, I think we should start. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome everyone to our biosimilars meeting, which is organized in collaboration with the Saudi Oncology Pharmacy Assembly and GaBI, the Generics and Biosimilars Initiative. Thankfully, Dr. Tang and Dr. Majid al-Shamrani were able to come up with this scientific program, which is aimed to facilitate the implementation process of biosimilars by providing valuable and practical information, as well as the challenges on assessing and the benefits of adopting biosimilars medicine presented by regulatory and healthcare experts in biosimilar medicine approval and implementation process. Our program today, we have three presentations presented by our experts, Dr. Robinthorpe and Dr. Elisha Wall and Dr. Frank Wallish. And then we're gonna have some time for Q&A, so please type your questions in the Q&A section where we're gonna have them all at the end of the presentations. Then we're gonna have our expert panel discussion with Dr. Mohammed Al-Nahab and our expert local group, Dr. Hana, Dr. Hani, Dr. Hajar, Faris Erbish, and Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Hassan, Dr. Mohammed Ahmed. Our meeting today, also all the discussion and Q&As, please just write it down in the Q&A section. If anyone wants to open a mic or add any information, I'm more than happy to do so. Just raise your hand and we will allow you to speak and be part of our discussion today. Please join me to welcome Dr. Hani Al-Hamdan. He's going to be our moderator for the first session. Dr. Hani.
Hello.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for the invitation to moderate this session by SOPA and for all the organizers. It's really a pleasure for me. I mean, it's addressing a very important and hot topic, I would say, in the region. And we are really delighted to have some very knowledgeable expert speakers in this symposium. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Robinthorpe. He is a former head of biotherapeutics group in the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control in the UK. Dr. Thorpe, he was the head of biotherapeutics group at the National Institute for Biologics and Standards and Control. Prior to retirement, he has worked in cytokines, monoclonal antidotes, antibodies, immunoglobulins, various biological products. As well, he is a member for the biological subcommittee and external advisory panel to the Committee of Safety of Medicine and the biologicals and vaccine expert in the advisory group of the Commission on Human Medicine in the UK as well. Dr. Thorpe, he is an advisor for the WHO INN biological group as well. He had published more than 250 publications in the scientific journals and books. So I'm sure that we are going to have a very thorough and very useful lights on the biosimilar regulatory development that will help us in the region. And he will be addressing the European experience in that. Dr. Robin.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Can you hear me at all?
Yes.
Yeah, fine, good, just checking. So as I said, what I want to talk about is clear from my title. You might say, well, why focus on the EU? And I think this is really just because of practical experience. The EU were the first to get into real biosimilars in a serious way, and they have approved a lot of biosimilars to date, too many for me to even remember. And they also have done this very successfully. So this is where the experience lies. So if you want to know, what to do with real biosimilars, look to the EU, because that's where all the information, most of the information really resides. Okay, so could I have the next slide, please? First of all, I think we need to define what we mean by biosimilars and also biologicals, as biosimilars are part of biologicals. This is a definition. It's a European type definition of biologicals, and it basically, I won't go through it because you can read it for yourself, and it basically says that biologicals are distinct from chemical pharmaceuticals in that they are really obtained from some form of biological source, and that of course can be varied. And examples of biopharmaceuticals or biologicals are now also very wide. And again, a list is given on the bottom of the slide. You can read it for yourself. What I'm particularly going to focus on for this talk is on the recombinant DNA products, protein products, as these are a huge class and are particularly relevant for biosimilar development. Could I have the next slide, please? It became evident, certainly in the EU, in the early 1990s, that a company may choose to develop not conventional biological products, but what are effectively thought of at the time as more or less copy biologicals. And these were termed biosimilars. And this is basically, this slide just shows you the legal basis for doing this. You can read it for yourself. Again, I'm not going to read it through because it's tedious. But basically, why I show this slide is that you do really need to have a legal basis for approving biosimilars. You can't just say, okay, well, we're going to start doing this willy-nilly. You need to have a legal basis for this, and this was very apparent in the EU because getting the legal basis together took longer than they thought, and actually it delayed adoption of some of the earlier biosimilars for this to be in place. So this kind of thing is very important, although it's not really scientific, it's more a legalistic issue. Could I have the next slide, please? This is an official definition of biosimilars in the EU. It's the EMA definition. It basically says here, quite clear, a biosimilar is a biological medicinal product that contains a version of the active substance of an already authorized original biological medicinal product, which is called the reference medicinal product. And a biosimilar demonstrates similarity to the reference medicinal product in terms of the important things: quality, characteristics, biological activity, safety, and efficacy. And this is determined by a comprehensive comparability exercise. So these biosimilars have to be directly compared to the biologicals that you are copying, and this has to be proved to be. They have to be proved to be comparable. You can't just assume it. Could I have the next slide, please? So nowadays, biosimilars are firmly established in the EU as copy biologicals with a clear and effective regulatory route for their approval, which allows marketing of safe and efficacious biosimilar products. And I think this is a real achievement. Many people, including me early on, were quite often not sure that this would actually take place, but it has. And so you can actually do it, although it's not easy. Could I have the next slide, please? So what are biosimilars? Well, it's quite clear from the EMA definitions, biosimilars are biologicals. They're in fact exactly the same as biologicals. They only differ from innovator biologicals in the regulatory process that's used for their approval. They don't actually differ. So if you actually took an originator biological and you took a biosimilar that had been developed against it, which is approved in the EU, they would be very, very similar. but they would have been approved by different regulatory processes. But as biosimilars are scientifically biologicals, they should be regarded as such when safety and potency is being considered, because they're exactly the same. And there's no reason to treat approved biosimilars any differently from all biologicals, including innovator products. They're basically the same. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? It's very important to stress the need for comparability studies. I already mentioned that these are necessary to generate the evidence substantiating the similar nature in terms of all important things, quality, safety, and efficacy of the biosimilar and the chosen reference medicinal product. And of course, these reference medicinal products, and I'll say more about these in a moment, these have to be authorized in the jurisdiction, which for the EU is, of course, the EEA. And the important thing to realize here is that you really do need to show this comparability. You can't assume it. You have to show it using appropriate technologies and methods. Could I have the next slide, please? So how do you do this? Well, you have quite a bit of flexibility of doing this, certainly in the EU, and of course now lots of other countries have developed procedures for development of biosimilars, and basically the way you do it is pretty similar, but it's not absolutely regimented. What is normally the way you would do it is you take a stepwise approach, and this is normally recommended to be applied throughout the development program, starting off with a comprehensive physical, chemical, and biological characterization. This is really very arduous. You have to do probably more from the physical, chemical, and biological characterization in vitro than you would for an originator product. And because you not only have to do this to characterize the product to show that it's appropriate, you also have to do the comparability exercise. So what do you gain for this? Well, the extent and nature of non-clinical and particularly clinical studies to be performed for approval depend on the level of evidence obtained in the previous steps, including the robustness of the physical, chemical, biological, and non-clinical in vitro data. So the better your physical, chemical, biological, and to some extent non-clinical data, the least you have to do clinically, or at least that's usually the case. Not always, but usually the case. Could I have the next slide, please? So what do you actually do? Well, this is a very simplest slide, but it does basically show what you normally do if you adopt this stepwise approach. First of all, you start off with a full quality characterization. So this characterization is the physical, chemical, and biological characterization. It's normally called a quality characterization in the EU. The Americans call it a CMC characterization, but it's the same thing. And this really has to show that the biological is suitable as a clinical grade product. And if you don't have this, then you really need to give up, because if it's not a clinical grade product, you will never get it approved as a biosimilar or as an originator, but particularly as a biosimilar. You then have to do a comparative quality assessment of the new product with the reference product to show what is effectively biosimilarity. And again, if you don't show that, you have to give up because you won't have a biosimilar. If you do all those things and they're all successful, then you need to do some kind of preclinical assessment, which can be extensive or usually for biologicals not, and then a clinical assessment, which you hope will be less than you would have to do for an originator product, because you've already shown that you basically have the same substance for your biosimilar as the reference product. Could I have the next slide, please? So what's the aim of the principles for establishing biosimilarity? Well, the ultimate aim or goal of the biosimilar comparability exercise is to exclude any relevant differences between the biosimilar and the reference product. For chemicals, chemical drugs, it's very easy to show that you actually have exactly the same chemical, for example, for generics. But for biologicals, this is not the case. Biologicals are much more complex. You even have a variation between batches of biologicals. And so it's very unlikely that a biosimilar will be identical to its reference product. But what you have to do is to show what these, if there are differences, and there will usually be, that they don't have any impact on clinical use. And therefore, the studies that you use to establish biosimilarity must be sensitive enough with regard to all important things, to detect differences between the products, because you are likely to find some of these. Could I have the next slide, please? This is what you hope to find, is that a biosimilar should be highly similar to the reference medicinal product in physical, chemical, and biological terms. And then, very importantly, any observed differences, which hopefully won't be very big, but they all have to be duly justified with regard to their potential impact on safety and efficacy. So what you hope you come out with when you've finished this extensive physical chemical characterization and then comparability assessment is that you have a few differences between your biosimilar and the reference product, but they have no potential impact on safety and efficacy. So they are effectively irrelevant from the clinical use of the product. If you could have the next slide, please. So again, when you consider what you do from the quality perspective, and we'll get on to other aspects in a minute, what you really need to aim at when you do present the data is that you look for, amongst the quality data, things that might have implications for safety and efficacy of use. And as I said, what you need to do for this is usually a stepwise approach, and you need to justify any differences you find, and you're likely to find some because of the nature of biologicals, and make a kind of assessment of those differences and why they are not going to be important from clinical use. Could I have the next slide, please? So what about the clinical part of this? Well, the clinical comparability exercise, as I said, and this should normally be, again, it's normally a stepwise procedure. It starts with things like PK, and if you can do them, PD studies, and then followed by hopefully not too large clinical efficacy and safety trials, or in certain cases not efficacy trials, but confirmatory PK/PD studies, for example, for GCSF biosimilars. These demonstrate not clinical efficacy, but clinical comparability, and this is quite different. So it needs a different design of the trials. They are comparability trials, not efficacy trials per se. Could I have the next slide, please? And this basically expands on this. Efficacy trials of biosimilar medicinal products do not aim at demonstrating efficacy per se, since this has already been established for the reference product. The sole purpose of efficacy trials for biosimilars is to investigate whether a clinically significant difference between the reference and biosimilar products can be detected, and hopefully you don't detect it. Clinical trials are not terribly sensitive for detecting these kind of differences. And so very often the clinical trial is even smaller than you might think it would have been for this reason. Could I have the next slide? The EMA, and in fact other countries, have produced quite a lot of guidance on biosimilar development. The EMA got into this very early on because they realized it was going to be difficult to do this, and they needed to have documentation in place which would guide people so that they would not do things incorrectly, as you might say. If you look at the guidelines that have been developed, as I said, there are quite a lot of them. They start off with being very general. You've got overarching guidelines, then you've got general guidelines on quality and non-clinical and clinical subjects, and then you've got more specific guidelines on individual substances such as erythropoietin, insulin, GCSF, monoclonal antibodies, etc. And these guidelines are all living documents. They can be updated. Most of them have actually been revised, some of them several times, to take account of experience and the rest of it. And there are more being produced. It's gone into a bit of a lull with the COVID problem, but they do put a lot of effort into producing this guidance, and I think that's partly why biosimilars have been so successful in the EU. Can I have the next slide, please?
Robin, a 5 minutes note.
Yes, fine. This is just a list. This may not be fully up to date because, as I said, biosimilars are approved quite almost routinely now in the EU, and some disappear because of various reasons. But this is a list that was current last year, and you'll see that basically the types of products made as biosimilars varies enormously, from very small molecules such as growth hormone right through to large things like monoclonal antibodies with just about everything in between. And basically you could make, I think, a biosimilar of most biologicals these days, with certain exceptions such as vaccines because of their complexity. But this is just a list just to show you that there's lots of biosimilars around, and there's going to be more in the future. Okay, you've moved on to the next slide. Right, so let's just consider now, as I said earlier, we need to consider the reference product and what you use it for. Well, the reference product, or sometimes called the reference medicinal product, is key and fundamental in the development of biosimilars. And this is because it's the comparator for all of the comparability studies, for quality, non-clinical and clinical assessment. So it's the thing that you make the comparison to. And it's ideally a product which has been approved and marketed in the relevant country or geographical area, and which has a long established history of good efficacy and safety. If you think about it, this is sort of almost obvious, because it would obviously be pointless making a biosimilar copy of something which isn't a good product, because you'd be making a bad product by default. So this is basically what you need to aim at, something with a good efficacy and safety record. Could I have the next slide? And this is a very important, sometimes forgotten aspect of making biosimilars. It should be the biological that you're using as the reference product needs to be marketed at a level which allows the purchase of a number of different batches. And a number, people often say, well, how many? Well, it's difficult to put a definite number on this, but it does need to be basically as many as you need and more. And this is so that the comparability assessment can be sufficiently thorough. It's obviously useless selecting a reference product which you can only get 2 batches, let's say. And this also implies that the most likely reference product for use as a comparator in biosimilar development will be the market leader in the country where the biosimilar is being developed. Although this is not actually a requirement, it doesn't have to be the case. It's just the way that it's bound to sort of turn out, if you think, because the market leader is going to have more batches on the market that you can buy than any other. And so that's why it tends to be the one that's selected. Although, as I say, that's not actually a requirement. And this has caused problems in some countries, not in the EU, but in some countries it's quite difficult to get hold of enough batches of a biosimilar. And this can be something you really need to think about when you're making biosimilars, so you don't get caught out. Could I have the next slide, please? So what about biosimilars outside the EU? Well, outside the EU, several countries have adopted an identical or similar regulatory approach to the EU for approval of biosimilars, such as Australia, Canada, Japan, and many others too. But I think more importantly to realize is that this is not the case for all countries. Several have different approaches. Some have inconsistent approaches, and some have no approach at all for biosimilars, even though they call products biosimilars. So there are products out on the market outside of the EU, some countries, which are called biosimilars, which aren't biosimilars from the EU point of view. Could I have the next slide, please? So what about globally? Well, if you think about globally, the best kind of body to look for global assistance with biosimilars is probably WHO. And WHO has produced a guideline for evaluation of what they call similar biotherapeutic products, which are effectively exactly the same as biosimilars, which proposes a very similar approach that described in the EU guidelines. And it's a pretty thorough, large guideline dealing with a lot of stuff you really need to know. And these guidelines are intended to be followed globally, everywhere. Particularly in places where you don't have your own guidance. WHO also have done a lot of work in attempting implementation of their guidelines and their approaches to biosimilar development. And there's a publication listed on this slide, which you can look up, and this discusses quite a lot of this. It's been published earlier this year. And there's another similar publication, which is a follow-on from this, and this basically relates to surveys that WHO have done in the biosimilar area. There's another publication which is being drafted but hasn't been published yet, but it will probably come out later this year or early next year. And so looking at these, it gives you a really good global view of biosimilars and biosimilar development. Could I have the next slide, please? So
I hope you
having said
are
that,
approaching end, Doctor.
yes, I think I'm nearly there. So one thing I think we need to consider right at the end here is, are all biosimilars really biosimilars? So the terms biosimilars, as I already said, similar biological products, innovative products, are often used interchangeably and incorrectly. So people are calling things biosimilars in certain countries that are not biosimilars. And these non-innovative products, or Me Too products, which are not biosimilars, have usually, almost always, never been evaluated using comprehensive comparability studies as required by WHO and EU guidelines and other guidelines. These are not biosimilars and should not be called biosimilars, but unfortunately, they very often are. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of these kind of products, which are not biosimilars, but are often called biosimilars in India, Iran, China, and other countries. And these are just not biosimilars, and they very often have problems associated with them. Could I have the next slide, please? So what about quality of products worldwide? Well, the quality of products varies worldwide. Some are very good, others are not. There's also a batch-to-batch consistency problem where different batches of a particular product vary in their attributes. And it's certainly the case, I've said before, some products called biosimilars in some countries are of inferior quality, but when you look at them, you turn out that they are not real biosimilars. There's a really shining example of this in Thailand, where there are lots of erythropoietin products which are called biosimilars, which have caused serious clinical problems. But then none of them are actually really biosimilars. They should never really have been called biosimilars. But what I should say is that the quality of biosimilars in the EU is very high, and just like innovative products. And could I have the final slide, please? So the conclusions. The lead taken by the EMA in providing a suitable regulatory process for the evaluation and approval of biosimilars has ensured that biosimilar approval is feasible, certainly, and that approved biosimilars in the EU are of appropriate quality. Biosimilars approved in the EU are evaluated according to criteria set out in a range of guidances which ensure necessary safety and efficacy. And that's what I would say you need to do. If you are going to get into the biosimilar area, you need to do basically what the EMA did. As then you will come out with safe and efficacious products. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thorpe, for this thorough, and I'm sure it was too short, too tight time for the, the subject. However, you made a very well progress there. So thank you very much. We're going to keep the questions to the end of the other presentation. So we'll move on to the next presentation, which is going to be jointly presented by Dr. Alicia Wall. She is currently the Director of Pharmacy for Eastern Health Canada. Formerly, she was the manager for the oncology pharmacy for the same institute, and she was handling the responsibilities of overseeing the oncology formulary management. The other speaker, Dr. Frank Walsh, he is as well from Canada, and he was responsible for identifying and documenting the institutional processes and steps for implementation of cost, employee required, and the time spent, resources, equipment, and cost. Both will be talking about biosimilar medicine implementation process and challenges institutional experience. So please, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for inviting us here today. We're very happy to talk about our experience. And I thought we'd start by providing some context around oncology drug funding processes within Canada and how we sort of applied this to our decision-making process upon implementing biosimilars. So our experience with biosimilars to date is relatively recent. We first implemented a bevacizumab biosimilar in December of 2019, and more recently a trastuzumab biosimilar in June of 2020. And so we would like to share some of the key considerations that we undertook while making a product selection. And then Frank will describe the implementation process in terms of the key concepts that was applied within the education that we provided to stakeholders, as well as the operational steps that were required and the impact of that. So when we talk about the Canadian healthcare system, we're really talking about a very fragmented, arguably, system that is not national in scope per se. The responsibility for healthcare rests with each of the 13 provinces and territories. And in that regard, you can see quite some differences from province to province, but there are fundamental underlying concepts that are the same. So healthcare in Canada is a decentralized, universal, publicly funded system. And while the responsibility for healthcare rests with the provinces and territories, and they primarily are responsible for the funding of healthcare, they do receive some federal funding through the Canada Health Transfers. And in order for provinces and territories to receive this funding, they have to adhere to the principles of the Canada Health Act. So this is an act that helps underlie the health services in each province. And really what the Health Act boils down to is arguably outdated at this point, but there will be universal coverage for medically necessary hospital and physician services. So those are the minimum requirements of the healthcare system. And because of that, there are many services that are excluded from universal funding, such as outpatient prescription drugs, including oral chemotherapy, dental care. Now, the benefits and the delivery of healthcare can vary between provinces, but there are commonalities as a result of the requirements of the Canada Health Act. And those requirements are essentially that the health system must be publicly administered, must be comprehensive within the definition of medically necessary, universal, portable from province to province if residents were to travel within the country, and accessible. And because this is really a system of multiple health systems within the country, historically there has been misalignment in funded oncology drugs across the country. So there would be disparities in terms of what patients can access within the province. Certain drugs were a benefit, whereas others weren't. Certain criteria was different, whereas others weren't. And because of this, another factor was that different provinces were really paying different prices for the same drugs dependent upon size. Large provinces such as Ontario had the bargaining power to achieve discounts, whereas small provinces such as Newfoundland and Labrador, where Frank and I are from, really didn't have the same leverage to achieve discounts. So there was various discrepancies across the country. And this led to, over the past number of years, the development of a really collaborative and cooperative approach between the provinces and territories to bring standardization to oncology drug access. So the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health is an independent health technology assessment organization that developed the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, or PCODR, which is the group that reviews and advises on public reimbursement decisions for oncology therapies. As well, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance developed, which is PCPA. It contains representation from all provinces and territories, and this group negotiates with manufacturers following a reimbursement recommendation from PCODR to achieve cost-effective pricing through confidential price agreements that would be equitable across the country. And as well, the Canadian Drug Implementation Advisory Committee, or CDIAC, evolved to help answer implementation questions such as funding criteria or exceptions that could be applied consistently across the country. So at the beginning of the oncology drug review pathway, of course, is regulatory approval. So Health Canada is the regulatory body that would review a product and make a decision as to whether it can be approved for use and marketed in Canada in terms of safety and efficacy. But of course, that is really a regulatory approval. It doesn't speak to the relative efficacy. It doesn't speak to the cost effectiveness. So that's where health technology assessment through PCODER comes in. And as I mentioned, once a reimbursement recommendation is issued by PCODER, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance will negotiate the price of the product, and then each individual provincial or territorial cancer agency will make decisions as to whether they will list the product as a benefit for residents or not. And underlying this process is the Cdiac Committee, which informs it at multiple steps. And I should point out that this is a continuous evolution. So the initial collaborative work began back in 2007. This image comes from a publication from only 3 years ago. However, it's already quite outdated. So as you can see, over the years, different groups evolved to help meet needs in achieving consistency in oncology drug access across the country. And most recently, beyond 2017, the Pan-Canadian Oncology Biosimilars Initiative was developed as a subgroup of the PCPA, again with representation from all provinces to help ensure a consistent approach to implementation of biosimilars across the country. As well, another working group has been established. It's known as the Can Revalue Initiative, and this is a group again with representation from clinicians and decision makers across the country to try to develop a pathway for reevaluation of funding decisions based on the collection of real-world evidence. And more recently, to avoid duplication of work, this CDIAC group has actually disbanded and its functions have been rolled into PCODER. Newfoundland and Labrador, as I've mentioned, is a relatively small province in terms of population, but it is large geographically. So we have among the smallest population density across the country. So it's much more individuals spread in remote and rural areas. The health system in Newfoundland and Labrador is divided into 4 regional health authorities by geography, and they operate relatively independently. However, to achieve consistency in cancer care across the province, we do have a provincial cancer care program that is operated by one of the health authorities, but it operates across all 4 health authorities. So we have 4 regional centers and 12 peripheral, which are more remote and rural centers whereby patients can receive cancer treatment. And I should point out that medical oncologists and radiation oncologists only operate out of St. John's, which is the capital within Eastern Health. All other centers, the treatments that patients receive would be overseen by family doctors or family doctors with additional training in oncology under the guidance of the medical oncologist within St. John's. The cancer care program pays for hospital administered IV oncology therapies, so universally with no out-of-pocket payments to patients. However, oral therapies and supportive care therapies are not funded by the cancer care program. So they require private pay by patients or the government prescription drug plan. And so as you can see, the oncology drug funding within the province could have the potential to be quite disjointed with the functioning of 4 separate regional health authorities. So for this reason, oncology drug decisions don't typically go through the P&T committees of these health authorities. We want to ensure that benefits are similarly available across all 4 health authorities where patients could potentially be receiving their treatment. And there is quite a robust health technology assessment system existing in Canada already. So as a province, we rely on the clinical and economic review that's already been completed by PCODER to inform our decision making. So our clinicians will prioritize drugs that have been recommended for reimbursement by PCODER. And then we will approach government for funding approval for each individual drug so that they can be consistently available across the province, no matter where the patient would be treated. And in our typical decision-making framework around listing oncology drugs is based on the P-code deliberative framework, where we consider the overall clinical effectiveness, the alignment with patient values, the cost effectiveness, and the feasibility of adopting the therapy into our existing health system. So in order to use this framework to inform our biosimilar decision-making, we looked at it slightly differently. So in terms of overall clinical effectiveness, we looked at the evidence that led to regulatory approval for the biosimilar, as well as our experience with the reference product. In terms of patient values, we wanted to ensure that we educated patients before making such a big change in our benefits that we were offering, and get their engagement as to what values they want in a biosimilar. In terms of cost effectiveness, so the pricing for biosimilars is negotiated by PCPA. And in considering how feasible would this product be to adopt into our system, well, we considered factors that were specific to the brands that were available, as well as some market considerations. But underlying this decision-making process is there needs to be an acceptance that biosimilars are essentially therapeutically equivalent to the reference product. So we need to be confident that once a biosimilar is approved by Health Canada, there should be no barriers or concerns for us to accept that as an alternative to the reference product. So we looked at deciding which biosimilar product to list as very much so a change management process. And with any change management, the most important thing was to engage stakeholders. So our physicians who would be prescribing it, the nurses who would be administering it, pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, and as well as getting patient input. So the first thing we had to decide was what would be our general implementation approach. Would we switch active patients who were on the reference product to the biosimilar, or would we pick an implementation date and only start new patients on the biosimilar? And arguably, the simplest approach would have been to switch all patients to the biosimilar, so that pharmacies would only have to carry one product, and there would hopefully be less risk of confusion. However, because, as I said, biosimilars for oncology are relatively new in the province as well as in Canada, the level of comfort was at this time to continue active patients on the reference product and then implement the biosimilar with new diagnoses. We also had to decide how we would approach the indications. So would we use biosimilar for a particular indication, or would we apply it to all indications that we currently fund the reference product for? And the decision was to apply it broadly for existing funded indications. So in terms of looking at the Health Canada approved indications, so as I've mentioned, we do accept the fact that they are therapeutically equivalent. However, we did want to look at the different products that were available on the market in terms of whether there were differences in what they received Health Canada regulatory approval for. And the benefit of this really was to understand, would there be a level of comfort among stakeholders to extrapolate to an off-label, non-approved indication? Would there be an opportunity to provide additional patient comfort and education so that they were aware that the drug you are receiving has been approved for your cancer type? One example where there are differences in Canada are within two bevacizumab biosimilar products at the time of implementation. One only had Health Canada approval for metastatic colorectal cancer, whereas another had an indication for metastatic colorectal cancer as well as platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. When we looked at the evidence supporting regulatory approval, once again, accepting the fact that if it is approved, it should be therapeutically equivalent to the originator. However, we wanted to ensure or determine whether there would be any advantages in terms of the trial population that was submitted to Health Canada. So, for example, there are several trastuzumab biosimilars available in Canada. One in particular was studied within the neoadjuvant and adjuvant breast cancer population, whereas the other was studied within the metastatic breast cancer population. Both have approval for both populations. However, the question was, would it give patients more confidence? Again, knowing this is a very new change, would it give patients more confidence so that you could educate them to say that the trastuzumab product you are receiving was studied in your type of cancer? As well, of course, we had to consider cost savings. So looking at our projected utilization, what was the pricing structure? Were there any rebates in terms of the volume that would be purchased? Did the pricing differ based on the indication? And if so, would that be very difficult for us to monitor and track? Were there any other financial incentives offered by listing a particular product? And I just want to point out that cost savings is part of the reason, of course, why we are switching to biosimilars, moving to biosimilars within the country. However, it's not the sole motivator in our decision making. In terms of market diversity, we wanted to ensure that we were making a decision that was going to support a healthy biosimilar market within the country. So we wanted to make sure that not all provinces were listing the same biosimilar, so that would encourage other competitors to come into market, not only to cause further savings in terms of price reductions through competition, but also to ensure that there are alternatives available in the event of a shortage. We certainly didn't want to monopolize the market with one product, so we reached out to other provinces to determine what brands they decided to use, what their population was, what's our population in relation, would it be advantageous for us to choose a different brand to ensure that there is competition. And then when weighing the different attributes of each approved biosimilar in terms of deciding which product to implement, we wanted to look at, were there any differences among them that might have an advantage? So are they all stored and stable the same as the originator product? Is there any difference that might make us want to choose one over the other or avoid one in particular? One example is there is a trastuzumab biosimilar on the Canadian market that does have data to show it can be stored at room temperature, which may be an advantage for sites that have very limited refrigerator space. We wanted to look at the labeling. Was the labeling very similar to another product? Would there be a risk of confusion for look-alike, sound-alike drugs? Does it look different enough, and is the labeling clear? Also, each product's compatibility with closed system transfer devices or robotics, whatever different compounding methods that were used at sites, wanted to ensure that whatever we decided to adopt was not going to cause any challenges with closed system transfer devices or robotics. And as well,
we're halfway through.
Okay, thank you. As well, we wanted to ensure that we were looking at the manufacturer's history of back orders, their history of drug shortages, if they have any history with customer service. Is this a manufacturer that we can rely on? Newfoundland is relatively remote. Things often are shipped in, and in the wintertime when weather is poor, sometimes we have delays in getting our drug delivery from manufacturers. So it was very important to us to consider what kind of support was in place if we were having challenges accessing inventory. So as I've mentioned, we approached it as a change management process that was really driven by engaging the stakeholders that would be most impacted by the change. And we incorporated all their feedback into deciding which product to list rather than solely focusing on cost savings. And as Frank is going to demonstrate, the education that we completed and the engagement with these stakeholders, I believe really supported a successful change in our practice, because people tend to support what they help build. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that Frank can take over with his slides.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Alicia. Also, thank you, Nora, and the other organizers for inviting us to this convention. I really look forward to sharing our experience and also learning from our colleagues in Saudi Arabia as well. Now I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Does that look okay?
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. So when I was appointed to the role of coordinating the introduction of biosimilars into the oncology treatment regimens for our province in September of last year, I sought guidance from other jurisdictions and also from our own national oncology groups in order to formulate the plan of introduction. And as Dr. Thorpe has mentioned earlier in his previous presentation, Europe has really been at the forefront globally of biosimilar adoption. So one reference that I would use to sort of gather my information was the British NHS biosimilar adoption plan. Also, the Pan-Canadian Pharmacy Alliance, they had the foresight to begin preparations for biosimilar induction on a national scale, and they created a group called the Pan-Canadian Oncology Biosimilar Initiative. And this was a group of nationwide group of oncologists, pharmacists, oncology nurses, technicians, and what their mandate was to prepare for the introduction of biosimilars across the country and provide guidance for the individual provinces, as Alicia mentioned, which sometimes have different structures in place. So this Pan-Canadian Oncology Biosimilar Initiative, or I'm going to call them PCOBI, they produce guidance documents for both the education and the clinical operations, which we utilized in our preparations. And it also provided train-to-trainer education and resources, which served as a starting point for me so that I could build upon when delivering education to our staff. And they also provided specific recommendation with regards to storage, the computerized physician order entry programs, labeling, and et cetera, via the Clinical Operations Working Group, which again was a valuable resource. Sorry. I have to advance my slide.
Frank, do you have a cam on your computer?
Oh, got it. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So firstly, I determined that education ought to be a major part of what I was doing. And it had to be a major focus. And several respected organizations that I referred to recognize the importance of education as part of a successful biosimilar introduction. And so this slide just illustrates the place of education within the NHS timeline to biosimilar adoption, and sort of placed it in the less than 3 months up until adoption timeline. So again, some other organizations, respected ones that we refer to through during our practice on a daily basis. So both Asco, so they recognize the importance of education in their position statements on biosimilar, and similarly, it's included in the PCOBI strategic objectives. Again, sort of highlighting that education is so important in bringing on any new biosimilars. Thank you. So this is the format of the that I took when of the initial education sessions, in which I introduced staff to the principles of biosimilarity. So the principles of inherent variability, comparability, the regulatory process for biosimilars and how it differs from what we're used to, extrapolation, totality of evidence, and pharmacovigilance. These were all addressed in these initial sessions. And these were all largely foreign concepts to our staff. So creating a base of biosimilar knowledge was really my strategy from the outset. And these are examples of the slides that I used within explanations of inherent variability, just as an example. And in it, I described how variability can arise naturally through, for example, different glycosylation patterns or through changes in the manufacturing processes. The regulatory framework is in place to assess these changes from a comparability perspective and will require varying degrees of data to determine comparability. And that's sort of illustrated in the slide to the right here. And this framework is what serves as the basis of assessment of biosimilarity among biologics. So there was a process in place based on manufacturing changes, which we can then apply to assessing new biologics. The bottom slide demonstrates variability in biologic function, and in this case, antigen binding over time. And I found this one useful to illustrate to folks new to biologics and biosimilars that one cannot think of a biologic medication as a constant exact replica over time. There is always variation, and the biologic that a patient received previously is not going to be the exact same that they receive today or in the future. So I thought once the inherent variability of biologics is accepted as a thing, then it's easier to accept biosimilars as not exact copies of originator biologics, but similar enough, so similar that the differences are insignificant. So again, these are examples of slides in which I reviewed the regulatory approval of biosimilars. Again, just providing some examples of how I've tried to get this across. So we're all familiar with the pyramid of evidence in which data builds upon each other to provide the increasing certainty of biosimilarity, and how it's inverted from what is typical from a reference biologic and other medications that we're used to. Whereas in biosimilars, it's the analytical study that forms the basis of similarity on which the other data builds upon. And the opposing slide here illustrates the key quality attributes in which the variability is demonstrated. And these attributes are the focus of these battery of tests during this analytical phase that builds upon the evidence. So again, still with regulatory approval, we discussed equivalence and non-inferiority and how that's different from the goal of superiority, which new medications are typically aiming for in their phase 3 studies. And then just referring to extrapolation and how it's based upon the totality of evidence. This is a concept that, from my experience, this proved the most challenging for some clinicians and staff. And so they've spent their careers basically making treatment decisions based on indication-specific phase 3 data. So to try to get across that it's the entire package of information that forms the basis of extrapolation, this was a bit of a challenging concept to get across. And so the totality of evidence, I think, really helps with that. So how was this education delivered? So it was done in person via tumor board presentations, grand rounds, nursing meetings, scheduled in services and advocacy group meetings. It was delivered online via Teams and Zoom platform meetings to physicians, pharmacists, technicians, and nurses outside of the main center. And these were live and recorded presentations, so staff could avail of them on their own schedule. I provided informational staff email, and these were usually kept brief, quick notes, and what I would do is emphasize key points from the guidance documents and fill in any perceived knowledge gaps, which would sometimes come from feedback from staff. So some examples would be just question and answer, quick question and answer emails, or myth versus facts with regard to biosimilars, but kept short and concise and sort of sticking to the main points and the main concepts of biosimilarity. Again, trying to build that knowledge base and comfort level. And then finally, staff and patient information resources. So these would be like printed documents, and we distribute them via email and physically put them in the clinics and email them to the nurses who could then print them and either provide them to patients or post them in their clinical areas. So another facet of my role as the coordinator of biosimilar implementation was to gather data in an effort to determine the cost of preparation and implementation of a biosimilar. So the top table here describes sort of the reach of the education programs that were presented, as indicated by the number of attendees as a proportion of total staff. And the bottom table includes a calculation of cost in terms of staff salaries while attending these biosimilar related meetings or events. And so it was thought that we might be able to use our data to provide a tool that other jurisdictions and institutions could use to predict what costs they might entail when preparing to introduce biosimilars into their formulary. And it's based on average contact hours of training staff that received education sessions before biosimilar education. So after the initial phase of education that focused on biosimilars in general, I embarked on a second phase to deliver brand-specific education. So we reviewed structural and functional comparisons from the analytical phase of testing, plus the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic data, and the confirmatory phase 3 trials of Mvasi and Zirabev. And in doing so, what I was aiming now was to build confidence in the staff in the specific biosimilars that we'd selected and their similarity to the originator. So as well as emphasizing the similarities between the originator and the biosimilar products, it is also important to describe if there's any differences. So for example, when we brought on the Kanjinti trastuzumab, the vial size of Kanjinti is different from the Canadian vial size of Herceptin, which is 440 milligrams. However, the volume of diluent required and the final concentration remain the same in this case. In order to predict the future education investment that would be required for subsequent biosimilars, we chose a measure based on the original bevacizumab education sessions. And so what we did is retrospectively, we looked at the site and profession-specific slide decks. And when we did so, it was consistent that 2/3 of the slides contained general biosimilar content and 1/3 was brand specific. So if we assume that there wouldn't be the same educational requirement in terms of general concepts, then there still remains this at least 1/3 of original material, the amount of the original material that would still have to be covered during education for subsequent biosimilars. So that sort of suggests that there is still a requirement beyond the initial implementation for support, staff support in terms of education. So as well as measuring sort of the staff's time in education, I measured my own time during implementation. So half of my time during the 3 months from my appointment up until the first bevacizumab biosimilar implementation was spent in educational research and development of the education programs. So first of all, taking in all the guidance documents that were available, the literature that was available at the time, and taking that and the templates from PCOBI and tailoring it to the different professions and tailoring it to the different sites within our province, be they the central one or the more remote locations. That is what took up most of my, we'll say, time. So if you add in again the time that was during of actually delivering this education, then it's up to 65%. So this was easily the most labor intensive aspect of implementation in my experience. And so this is also illustrated in a timeline that I prepared, which ran throughout 2019 up until the first biosimilar implementation, which was in December. And I produced this timeline based on my daily journal entries or tasks. And so this again shows that literature review and education plan development commenced immediately upon me assuming this role of project lead and continued right up until the days before implementation. And this slide also illustrates the facet of work that was second only to education as the most time intensive, and which I'll discuss now. And that is the computerized physician order entry and the written prescription templates, which had to be worked upon to implement biosimilars. So again, referring back to the pie chart and just showing again the time that was required in doing this. So it made up 27% of my preparation time, which is highlighted in the yellow section. So this, for me, once we actually implemented the first biosimilar, was higher than I expected that it would be. But having gone through the process, I think I have some explanations as to why that was now. So there was three aspects of the systems that we use that I think affected our CPOE process. One was that we use a system called ARIA. And ARIA is a very labor-intensive system. And currently at our site, it requires 2 full-time equivalent positions just to maintain this system and add new regimens and any maintenance that's required. So this is not something that I could delegate to them to do. They already had their plate full, so I had to take it on solely. Secondly, there were some limitations whereby our CPOE system would only allow the brand name in the medication field. And in order to utilize the interaction software that comes along with ARIA, this is how we had to enter. So we'd enter by brand name only. Health Canada recommendations require that both brand and non-proprietary name have to be present in all stages of medication ordering and dispensing. So we had to work around that and produce a separate field within the ordering and labeling process whereby bevacizumab was included. And the third thing among our systems which caused some additional work was the fact that our CPOE system and the system that we use for inventory and dispensing are separate, and there's no interaction between the two, so we had to do some duplication of effort there. And then there were decisions that we took that affected the work required in the CPOE piece. So by grandfathering patients, we allowed those already receiving the originator biologic to continue on the same biologic, as Alicia already mentioned. So patients were not required to switch mid-therapy. And therefore, so I needed to create new CPOE regimens and amend the ones that we already had. And so our list of bevacizumab regimens effectively doubled. A second consideration is that for bevacizumab, we decided to carry 2 biosimilars, and Mvasi and Zirabev. And this was largely due to, there was numerous supply problems that had been occurring over the years previous to introduction. And we felt that it might derail the entire acceptance of biosimilars should we run into drug shortage issues early in the implementation. So, and we used biosimilar according to indication, realizing that the principles of biosimilarity, that any drug could use an extrapolation that any approved biosimilar should be used for any of the approved indications of the originator. However, we chose to use Zirabev strictly for the gynecological indications and Mvasi for all others, just because it separated the groups nicely and would cause less confusion amongst the physician groups, we thought. And finally, although it would have been much easier for me to simply change all the current Avastin orders to bevacizumab and leave it to the dispensing pharmacist and the administering nurse to determine the appropriate brand, we chose not to. And one reason was because we felt it placed too much of a burden on those pharmacists and nurses. And this is especially so in the peripheral treatment centers that we also serve. And they, as Alicia mentioned, they lack a medical oncologist on site. And the presence of oncology pharmacists is not as concentrated and sometimes non-existent in the peripheral sites. So
I hope you are finishing.
Yep. And so secondly, I was a full-time lead, and I had the time basically to take on this work. And so I created brand-specific regimens to alleviate that work on the others. So based upon this, all these factors, I amended the 21 current Avastin regimens to follow the Health Canada nomenclature requirements, in that Avastin and bevacizumab have to be included on all orders. Configured the CPOE so that Avastin was unavailable to new starts as of the implementation date, while maintaining access for patients previously receiving an Avastin containing regimen, and create 21 new regimens for the bevacizumab indications I mentioned earlier for Zirabev and Mvasi. Important to keep in mind that it's not just me that is involved in regimen creation. So our process is that any builds or edits to CPOE have to be reviewed by the relevant pharmacist in whichever indication it applies to. They review it. If there's any recommendations, it comes back to me and I have to send it to them again. Once they're happy with it, they sign off, and then it goes to the relevant medical oncologist. And only once we have their signature can the regimen be activated. So this adds to the time constraints. So at implementation, as of the implementation date, Avastin-containing regimens were removed from the available CPOE templates. Discontinued regimens were replaced with biosimilar-containing regimens. Physicians reordering an Avastin regimen would receive an alert screen informing them of the naming change and requiring their acknowledgement in order to proceed. For the time being, we kept the chemotherapy letter and PPO templates containing Avastin active to allow for reordering in the peripheral centers, and these are revisited periodically for removal. And this is an example of our CPOE order and the product label, making sure that throughout the process, both the brand name Mvasi and the non-proprietary name bevacizumab are present. Briefly about chemotherapy letters and what they are and why they affected our rollout. So 25% of chemotherapy treatments within our province are delivered outside of the main cancer center. And as Alicia mentioned, their treatment is supervised by a family physician usually. So when the medical oncologists see them in the main site, they provide instructions for treatment via a chemotherapy letter, and that includes the regimen with dosing and frequency, supportive medications, monitoring parameters, and the recommended follow-up schedule. The chemotherapy letters themselves are maintained by us, the oncology pharmacists, and therefore 40 new templates were required for bevacizumab to correspond to the new CPOE regimens, and each letter template went through the same review process as new CPOE regimens involving the relevant oncology pharmacist and medical oncologist. Just showing you what a pre-printed order looks like from our institution. So these again are utilized by the peripheral treatment centers that don't have the CPOE access. We post them to our cancer care website. They're maintained again by the oncology pharmacists. Any changes or adaptations go through the same process again. So it's labor and time intensive. In terms of storage and inventory, so it was important to review the data of purchasing prior to leading up to implementation so we could forecast the inventory of each biologic that we'd require during the transitional period. It was important. We had to create a separate database entry for our inventory system for the original biologic and biosimilar, determine if there's any storage or differences, if there's any, between the originator. And when it came to storage, we try to ensure physical separation from the originator in the storage areas. If it was necessary to put them together, which it turned out it wasn't, but for sites that are challenged in terms of space, they could store them together, but store them alphabetically based on the brand name. And then utilize the auxiliary labeling and shelf talkers to look alike, sound alike labels. In terms of specifically for patients in clinic and that and counseling, so patients are educated in clinic about bevacizumab, and the consent that they sign is consent to receive bevacizumab. We don't distinguish between the brands. We accept that they are biosimilar, and so clinically any differences are insignificant. The patient education that we give to patients is published by two of the leading cancer agencies in Canada, those being in Ontario and British Columbia, and their published documents, again, they do not distinguish. They realize that bevacizumab can come in several forms. Something else we added was a handout with some short questions and answers about biosimilars, and a link to me if there were any follow-up questions. So in terms of pharmacovigilance and adherence, so decisions as to how to prescribe bevacizumab were made as a group and administered via CPOE, so change leadership that Alicia mentioned. So essentially we have full adherence. Everybody bought in from the beginning, so we don't have these issues as we proceed. There was 2 occasions in which Avastin was used inadvertently within the 6 months, and that was the result of having left those chemotherapy letter templates available to physicians. Once we addressed with the physician group, informed them of the error and determined whether we could remove them. We've since removed those. And in terms of pharmacovigilance, as of June 2020, so that marks 6 months since we introduced bevacizumab, there have been no reported adverse effects attributed to either bevacizumab biosimilar. The budget impact, so our decision to grandfather patients is not going to result in an immediate realization of savings, but it's going to be more gradual, of course. So as an example, in December, when we administered bevacizumab and started and looking back at the data beginning then, of the 22 patients that were receiving Avastin, 20 of those were receiving the Avastin brand and only 2 biosimilar. As of June of this year, of the 23 patients receiving bevacizumab, only 6 were receiving Avastin. So it's a gradual process. But despite that having been only implemented for the first 3 months of the most recent fiscal year, the purchases of Avastin in total for that year were down 20%, and that's despite total bevacizumab purchases being up by 14%. So we're already seeing some benefit. And as the numbers of patients receiving Avastin decline, we do expect to see an eventual 60% decrease in total drug costs attributed to bevacizumab. So that's investment that we can use in other areas. So I'll pass over to Alicia for the final conclusion.
So I hope you can tell from our experience that it was quite labor intensive and time consuming, but despite this, we feel it has been a very successful implementation. It's been a sustained change. Some of the keys to our success are, of course, the national processes that have developed to support oncology drug funding and the collaboration with other provinces. But I think the important thing is that we did approach this as change leadership, change management by focusing on stakeholder engagement and bringing stakeholders into the decision-making process, considering factors beyond only cost savings. And as well, Frank has clearly demonstrated that he took quite a lot of work on in helping with bevacizumab and trastuzumab and other biosimilar implementation. And a big part of our success was that Frank was available as a full-time resource solely focused on leading implementation. He clearly developed and delivered a very comprehensive education program, oversaw all the operational processes that were needed for success on the date of going live with implementation. And I think it's been very valuable that he's been able to focus on monitoring our progress and also measuring outcomes along the way. So thank you very much for your time today. We're very happy to discuss and answer any questions.
Thank you all. That was really a neck-twisting lecture and experience. Very, very interesting. So maybe we can start our Q&A session right now. I had a question before from the audience for Dr. Thorpe, but I believe maybe I can see it here. Does by any means the biosimilar showed superiority over original biological? Also, does biosimilar could show approvals over or for new indications where original one is not? That's for you, Dr. Robin.
Yeah, I don't know whether I heard, I didn't hear the questions terribly clearly. I think the first question was, do some biosimilars show superiority?
Exactly.
Well, that's not the aim at all. There's been a lot of hype and talk about these kind of bio-betters, which would be these kind of substances. But the aim of biosimilar development is to produce something which is very similar. And so it's very unlikely that it's going to be superior.
Okay.
Having said that, some biosimilars do show advantages which have not necessarily been clear when during the approval process. It's quite clear that biosimilars are newer than the originators simply by the way in which they're made, and of course technology always advances, and so they may be made by processes which are better in various ways than the originator had access to. And so there is some claim in some cases that they are better, purer, but I don't think that really is clearly of any real importance from the clinical perspective of efficacy and safety. It's very difficult to judge anyway.
Yeah, that's clear enough. So if I may ask, from European experience and then from Canadian experience, if there are like certain problems that it comes to your mind whenever you are talking about biosimilars that you encountered, and how did you solve it? One problem that is like out there when you talk about biosimilars. Well, let's start with you, Dr. Robin.
Oh, that's a very sort of general question. I'll focus on the kind of scientific side of it. I mean, what I should stress, and it's been misrepresented certainly some in the early days, is that making biosimilars is not an easy option. It's difficult, particularly the quality assessment. It's very extensive, very time-consuming, very resource-consuming. It's not an easy option. It's basically a different approach to achieve the same thing. And all the aim is with biosimilars and with originator products is to produce appropriate clinical products. It's the same aim. It's just achieved in a different way. But it's certainly not easy. And I think a lot of manufacturers of biosimilars, particularly in the early days, grossly misunderstood that and underestimated the amount of effort and particularly resources that were needed, and basically failed to produce biosimilars, which basically fell by the wayside. You don't see it reported in kind of EMA documentation because, of course, the products never reached the reviewing stage. So it's a bit misleading. You think there's been a lot of biosimilars approved and not many failures. In fact, there are far more failures than you think there are because of this kind of dropout kind of rate. So that was a real big problem that I've seen from a scientific point of view. Underestimation of the things you need to do to get to a successful, approvable biosimilar. Other things are the more technical, like the failure to select the right reference product. That's caused problems in the past. Haven't heard of any more recently, but certainly in the early days. And then, of course, there's the more clinical point of uptake. Uptake is very difficult because just because you have an approved biosimilar doesn't mean that clinicians are going to use it. And that's caused huge problems, which I won't go into in any more detail because it's a huge subject.
Yeah, maybe that can be answered maybe, or another challenge that was encountered at the practice side, like from the Canadian perspective. Any challenges that you faced and you overcame that?
So from my perspective, and I guess Frank can add some challenges from an operational side, but from my perspective, I think one of the challenges that we have in Canada right now is that it is still a relatively premature market. We have relatively few options available. Their Health Canada approval has been quite staggered to the point that, the first entrant to the market, what we first saw was once it went through a price negotiation by PCPA, there was good uptake, but in the sense that that could be a negative because it didn't leave much room in the market for other entrants to come on. Because of course, this change management process is so large. Once a province selects one product, they're unlikely to switch to a different product. And in Newfoundland, I guess we were several months behind other provinces in terms of deciding on a product. So we intentionally would try to focus on products that didn't have widespread use elsewhere to help try to keep that market diverse.
So I don't want to take really a long time. I have some question raised by Dr. Khan. Mansour Khan, if you can come forward, Dr. Khan.
Thank you, Dr. Hani. Thank you, all the presenters. I really enjoyed all the presentation, very relevant to the point and comprehensive presentation, especially the last presentation, Dr. Frank, was very relevant. And for a fraction of a second, I thought that he's working in my hospital because we have very similar approach in our hospital, and we have even the same CPOE, and we have the area. And we have also the two people maintaining the area. So for a fraction of a second, I thought he's working in our hospital. I have a question, actually. This is regarding, Dr. Frank mentioned that they have two biosimilars of bevacizumab in their formulary. I know, there are different versions of trastuzumab. We have seen from 2000 to 2017, there have been 52 different versions of the Herceptin trastuzumab within the same molecule of the Roche Herceptin, and definitely they were not identical, completely identical. But what I've heard from different organization and European Union perspective and some other experts, so most of the people, they're recommending not to keep more than one biosimilar in the formulary because of some issues such as immunogenicity issues, and also the pharmacovigilance tracking becomes a little bit tricky if you have more than one biosimilar available at the same time in the hospital, and we really don't know which biosimilar patient is receiving. Although you must have the pharmacovigilance approaches, but the risk of immunogenicity will be theoretically high if you have more than one biosimilar. So what we have decided here in our hospital, in our country, that we will keep only one kind of biosimilar in the hospital. So what do you think about it? The issues of immunogenicity, Dr. Frank.
Right, thank you. And if you have the same systems that we do, I feel sorry for you. But in terms of immunogenicity, so when we carry two biosimilars for bevacizumab, and we haven't followed the same approach for subsequent ones, but when we carry two, my understanding is that the immunogenicity issue is only going to be relevant if the same patient is receiving the different biosimilar, like if we're switching back and forth. We purposely kept them apart. So anyone that receives a gynecological diagnosis and is being treated for a gynecological indication receives Zirabev, and nobody else. And anyone that has any other indication aside from a gynecological indication receives Amvasi and nothing else. So it was easier to delineate because we have two sort of separate services. We have the gynecology oncology service, and we have the medical oncology service. And so it was easy, again, via CPOE to limit which medications a physician has access to. So the gyne-oncs would only have access to Zirabev. They could not order Amvasi. And the med-oncs would only have access to Amvasi and couldn't order Zirabev. From the pharmacy point of view, I guess that's where the importance of appropriate tracking, the pharmacovigilance type measures, the compounding sheets and things like that, which we've been enacting to follow the NEPRA standards and that. So those are, if you have those type of measures in place, I think that gives you a little more comfort level with having more than one biosimilar on hand. But I take your concerns; they are valid for sure. And it is our indication, or it has been our intention, and that's what we've done with trastuzumab, is to only carry one. Yeah, does that answer your questions?
Yeah, that's pretty clear. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. Dr. Frank, so I have a really burning question from one of the participants that is there any clinical issues in substituting original to biosimilar for same patient, and how to conduct it? Means that, I mean, how do you convince all physicians and the patients that what you are, I mean, aiming for is quite right?
I'll jump in for a sec. So I think in order to, so the main source of education for the patient is the physician. So my approach has been, if you had to educate that physician has to have an extremely comfortable association with biosimilars. And if the physician is on board, then the patient is more likely to be. So I think with the physicians, what I found was most important was providing unbiased, evidence-based medicine, referring to the guidelines that the respected organizations have published that indicate their comfort level, looking at the European experience and how long that they've been using biosimilars to good effect. And I think engaging the physicians and bringing them on board and allowing them to gain a comfort level with them, I think that sort of filters down to the patient. That's my thought.
Thank you very much. Actually, there are lots of questions, honestly, I'm receiving on my WhatsApp, and I had about 10 questions while you were all delivering your messages, but maybe we can communicate via emails because we want really to learn from your experiences. It was really so, I mean, valid. I can tell it from a perspective of a director of pharmaceutical care and with the oncology center responsibility. So I would really stop here. So to respecting the time for the whole symposium, and thank you all for the presentations, and thank you for accepting me to moderate, and hopefully to see you again, and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. See you then.
Thank you, everyone. We will stop for 5 minutes to pray, and then we will come back to our panel discussion. Dr. Tang, if you want to join us, Frank and Alicia too. I know, Dr. Robin, that you have a meeting. We're more than happy to have you during our panel discussion, which is going to be started in 5 minutes. We're just going to take a short break for praying.
Okay. Thank you. And then it will be good to share the questions, and we can try to give feedback and information.
For sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. See you then. Bye-bye.
Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. Dr. Nora, if you can just verify if you're able to hear my voice.
نسمعك دكتور محمد تفضل.
Very good. So welcome to the panel discussion entitled The Role of Multidisciplinary P&T Committee within the Healthcare Institution in Adopting Biosimilars. My name is Mohammed Al-Nahab and I have the pleasure to moderate this session. Before we get started, let me go ahead and introduce our great panelists today. So we have Dr. Hani Al-Hashimi, who's the director of the Oncology Center at King Fahd Specialist Hospital in Dammam. We have Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Hassan, who's the director of Pharmacy Services at King Saud University Medical City. We also have Dr. Hana Al-Abd Al-Karim. She's the director of Drug Policy and Economic Center over at National Guard Hospital in Riyadh. We have Dr. Hajar Al-Mdahim. She's the advisor to the Assistant Deputy of Therapeutic Supportive Services at the MOH. We also have Dr. Faris Al-Rubaysh, who's the Medication Safety Specialist at the Drug Safety and Risk Management Department over at the Saudi FDA. So again, welcome everybody. So we'll start off by, we heard about the European experience and we also heard about the Canadian experience. So let's talk about the Saudi experience. So I guess the first question will be about the experience in different perspective in terms of prescribing. I know we have a physician here, Dr. Hani Al-Hashimi, and he's also an administrative, and also he wears many hats in at the OMOH. We want to hear about the prescribing aspect and experience, if there is any, and also the experience with registering these products at the MOH formulary. So Dr. Hani, if you can kindly provide an insight about the MOH experience with the using biosimilars. Dr. Hani Al-Hashimi, are you able to join? Yes. Or if there's he's probably having some difficulties. Or Dr. Hajar, if I know Dr. Hajar, you work also for the MOH. If you can kindly. عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
معلش دوري لسه بس توضيت بصلي انتوا ما شاء الله بديتوا.
الله يعطيك العافية. Sure. So, Dr. Hani, did you able to hear the question? I guess so. To make it just clear, I know you're a physician and you probably have a chance to prescribe some of these products. And I also know that you're also involved in the P&T committee over at the MOH. So it's good to share that experience at the MOH, whether from the prescribing aspect and also from the administrative and leadership aspect.
طيب الله يديك العافية. Thank you very much for the invitation from SOPA and very يعني hot and interesting topic globally. I think ما هو بس at the level of Saudi Arabia. يعني I had the pleasure of working with the local and also at the level of MOH with زملاء هاجر ودكتور أحمد الجديع at the P&T for the oncology drugs. And I'm happy to hear the experience that our colleagues from Newfoundland in Canada shared with regard to the medication and how they selected the two out of for BEV and the other for breast cancer. Cost is a major thing. Definitely, anytime you present evidence, on the other side, budget and finance and all those limitations has to be taken into account. Major work done over the past 2 years by the MOH to standardize, probably starting with standardization of available chemotherapeutic agents was the starting point. And we are reaching now to talk more about biologics and probably biosimilar as well. At a local point of view, at our hospital, we have now filgrastim as a biologic that has been approved as a biosimilar. As an experience in such indication, it was not, I have to say, it was not too difficult for the administration to accept the idea. It was difficult from the medical side to accept the idea, since most of the physicians not yet well informed or educated about what's happening in the industry and biosimilar biologics. So it took a bit of a time. As our colleagues indicated, education was actually a very important part of implementation. So it comes hands in hand. After a while, we actually were able to successfully bring the product to actually utilization, and that have a major impact on the budget for sure. At the national level, probably if Dr. Hajar is actually with us, I think we are going in that direction as well. With the multi-stakeholder involvement, not only Ministry of Health, but all other health care providers and sectors. And hopefully we'll be able to come to a conclusion that bring biosimilar practice into play, not only in oncology, but in all the other fields of medicine as well.
Sounds great. So Dr. Hani, as a physician, how do you feel the confidence and the comfort level with other physicians when we talk about biosimilars? Do you think there is still a lot of way to go, or you think we still need to provide more education and assurance and awareness to raise?
This is actually a moving target. As our colleagues just talked about the difference between generic, about biologic and biosimilar, and the Me Too and the copy product, which is very, very headache tasted for everybody, especially when it comes from areas where there is issues with. On a personal level, I know the stepwise approach that our Saudi FDA is taking to bring such medication into the country, and I'm on a personal level comfortable with. However, probably more education to the medical community, physician, pharmacists, and so on, is needed over the next couple of years, just to bring everybody to the same understanding. When we talk about biosimilar, this is actually stepwise approved medications that went through all the regulatory component, and it's not one of those copies that is produced in other parts of the world that doesn't meet the standards stepwise approach for approval. But it will take time for sure.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Hani. So speaking of the MOH, I know we have Dr. Hajar here also from the MOH. Dr. Hajar, if you can give us an insight about the registration process or the formulary addition, how do you guys handle these biosimilars? Do you handle them separately, or they undergo the same channels with other products? So Dr. Hajar, if you can go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much for the invitation for today's topic. I know it's very really a hot topic now, I think in all the country. So for us, for MOH, adopting the biosimilar, we are very biosimilar adopting to our formulary. So we are very pro biosimilars. We do have a criteria of having them evaluated in a levels of effectiveness and efficacy and pharmacoeconomics impact as well. We have a policy in MOH that we don't carry the originator and the biosimilar in our formulary. So when we are going to discuss or evaluate the medication or the biosimilar versus our originator, we tend to delete one and keep just one in our formulary. So this just to make sure that we don't have any immunogenicity and to make sure our patients all receiving the same medication, so we don't have any interruption in either supply or even in introducing such medication to our formulary in our all hospitals. Again, continuing on Dr. Hani, we eventually completed the unification of MOH oncology formulary under all hospitals and cities under MOH. There is another initiative under the Saudi Health Council in coming and adopting a unified formulary that reflects the need in each service and specialty for oncology and hematology formulary. So again, and there is another subcommittee that is under the corporate P&T that handles the biologics and biosimilars. And hopefully we're working now on a policy that will be implemented in across the MOH soon, inshallah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Hajar. Dr. Muhammad Ahmed from King Faisal Specialist Hospital. I know you're a coordinator of a biosimilars committee or subcommittee. If you can kindly share your experience with these products in terms of evaluation and cost impact at the hospital.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mohammed, and thank you to all the panelists and speakers earlier on today. It's very fruitful presentations and discussions. So in terms of our experience, local experience at King Faisal, what we had is around late 2017, early 2018, we had a biological and biosimilar task force, which later became a subcommittee under the main PNT. And our aim at the beginning was to focus primarily on non-oncology biological agents, mainly used for inflammatory conditions such as inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, as well as psoriasis. And similar to what was mentioned in the MOH process, we treated biosimilar agents as new drugs. So there was a full drug evaluation into safety and efficacy, as well as a cost analysis. Now, I'm sure this will be picked up during the discussion today, but one of the things that when we started in 2017-18, there weren't that many biologicals available locally in the market. There was the insulin, there was the growth hormone, and I think infliximab, and shortly after that, the newer agent, the other agents became available. So now we've got more agents becoming available. But when we started off our process, we didn't have that many biological agents available to us. One of the areas that we ran into locally was that when we looked at, say, infliximab, for example, we didn't see a huge difference in the cost because the availability of the infliximab biosimilar resulted in the originator company reducing their prices quite drastically. So at the sort of institutional level, we didn't identify a massive difference that sort of justified perhaps switching to a biosimilar. So that has been our experience with biosimilars so far. Now we're in the process now again of undertaking a review of the non-oncology biosimilars. Adalimumab is our sort of forerunner at the moment, as well as etanercept. So that's been our experience so far.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mohammed. So speaking of the cost and cost impact, I'd like to ask Dr. Hana. I know cost impact is your thing. So were there any exercises that you make, Dr. Hana, at the National Guard? Were there any initiatives or any positive or impressive experiences when it comes to biosimilars and significant cost saving at the National Guard?
Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel discussion. In National Guard, I believe we were the first to adapt a biosimilar in the country when we adapted the filgrastim biosimilar back in, I believe, 2014. So we have, let's say, a longer and richer experience compared to other sectors. Now we have between 5 to 6 biosimilars in the formulary. We do have guidelines for the that guide decision-making process of adapting biosimilars in National Guard. Now maybe we have between 3 and 4 other biosimilars under evaluation. As you know, Dr. Mohammed, with regard to your question, the main to adapt a biosimilar is cost saving. If there is no significant cost saving, there is no reason to have a biosimilar in your formulary. Usually we do conduct a pharmacoeconomic evaluation for any drug that is reviewed by BNT and National Guard. However, with regard to biosimilars, since to be highly similar to the biologics, cost effectiveness analyses are not usually conducted, since we assume that these drugs are equally effective. So what we do is mainly a cost minimization analysis or a total budget impact analysis. I would just point out here that it is very important to make sure that the relative price difference between a biologic and its biosimilar significant enough to cover all the hidden costs of the shift to a biosimilar. For example, if you adapt a new biosimilar based on our experience, let's say, for example, the addition of insulin glargine biosimilar. As you know, the population of diabetic patients in our country is really high. So it requires appointment for all the current patients to take baseline labs, educate the patients about the new medication. So there is also the cost and the expensive treatment options in case of failure or resistance to the current biosimilar. So you need to make sure that the difference between the biosimilar and the original drug is significant enough to cover all these costs and to provide you with a good cost saving to make it with a new agent. So as I said, cost is not the only factor, but it's the main reason behind adding biosimilars. So you need to be very careful when calculating and negotiating biosimilars with companies.
Perfect. يعطيك العافية دكتورة هنا. Next question I'd like to ask about the pharmacovigilance and the post-marketing surveillance. Dr. Faris, we have Dr. Faris Sarbesh from the Saudi FDA. So being a medication safety specialist, can you give us an insight how are the surveillance programs are being conducted for these biosimilars?
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, and thank you for the other panelists for the insightful discussion. And thanks to the Saudi Oncology Pharmacy Assembly for the invitation. So just let me start with a reminder of the goal of pharmacovigilance and or post-marketing drug safety surveillance. Our goal or principle is to minimize the time between the introduction of the medication into the market and the discovery of serious adverse event. So as we've talked today is that we have some issues with biosimilars product as they pose a unique challenge. They're not necessarily not safe, but we're not used to surveillance of these medications. So our goal is to monitor and assess, prevent these adverse events. So we have 3 different factors or key players that we work with. The first one is the manufacturer company. They're always continuously assessing the medication from their side point. They are also continuously in communication with us, giving the variability a challenge with these medications. In addition, we work and we rely on information provided by healthcare providers as well as the public. So one of the key factors that I want to point out is the issue of traceability with biosimilar products. Is that we need to identify the product. Are you using the originator or the biosimilar products? In addition, we would like always to know the patch number in order to locate and identify any issues related to safety, such as immunogenicity. So in the beginning of this year, we looked back retrospectively to the National Pharmacovigilance databases, that's Tayaqqud or Vigilance, where we receive adverse event reports by healthcare providers, patients, and pharmaceutical companies. We identified around 322 adverse event reports that are of biosimilar as well as the biologic. Now, given the importance of traceability, we looked to see if the reporter recorded the name appropriately. And we were shocked that to find only 97 reports out of the 322, which is approximately 30% of these adverse events that actually included the trade name. In addition, we looked at the reporter if they actually included the batch number. It was the same thing. We had about 224 of these case reports, or about 70% of adverse event that did not include the batch number. Now, what does the analysis demonstrate? It demonstrates the need to educate providers and the public of the importance of traceability of biosimilar products. So they were approved based on comparability measures by the pre-marketing in order to give them the marketing authorization. However, we would like to monitor these medications' safety. Now, one of the issues that we were not sure is that are these biosimilar products are being used or not. In addition, we're not sure if maybe they are just safe. Like we've heard from the Canadian experience, they did not have any safety issue, so they might be just safe. However, in the vigilance department, we're always trying to monitor closely, actively and proactively all medications. However, as I mentioned before, it's just the challenge with biosimilar products is the availability, the ability to actually trace back the medicine. Is it caused by the medication itself inherited safety profile, or is it something it was introduced during the manufacturing or biosynthesis? So I guess our message is to healthcare provider is to pay extra attention to report in case of safety adverse event or suspected safety adverse event, is to report the trade name as well as the patch number. So thank you.
Perfect. يعطيك العافية. Thank you so much. That was very helpful. Moving on to King Saud University Medical City experience, we have Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Hassan, who is the pharmacy director. Dr. Abdulaziz, I'd like to ask you if you can share if there are any operational challenges associated with the biosimilar. If you can give an insight about these challenges and how did you overcome these challenges?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. First of all, I would like to thank you for having me today, and it's great to have GaBI again. Back in 2018, with last year working with me on establishing or on providing this kind of summit. And I would like to thank SOPA for arranging and providing this valuable meeting. Talking about biosimilars, it's very controversial. I just want to highlight something before I start. Dr. Hani mentioned something in the beginning about the acceptability of physicians toward having biosimilars in the formulary. I remember the second week of being a pharmacy director, I received a letter from one of the medical departments asking me, please to not include any biosimilar in our formulary till we have been on board or like we have been consulted. And surprisingly, this medical department is one of the biggest attractive or possible department to use biosimilars. And given this concern coming from physicians or from a medical department, it's a question mark that we as pharmacists, we need to act proactively to avoid harming our patients, and also balancing between cost and also efficacy. That being said, I think our experience with biosimilars at King Saud University Medical City is not as mature as King Faisal Specialist Hospital or also the National Guard. They have their own oncology centers or hospitals from long time ago, and they have a wide experience. We just started a few years ago with our oncology center, and also plus the other medical departments getting expanded. So our experience is not that big as others. The biggest challenge, I think, I'm going to bring it from one side, and then we'll discuss it from the other sides. The availability of biosimilars, comparing them to the originators. It's one of the biggest challenges that we may face if we have approved having them in our formulary. On the other hand, sometimes handling these medications in the pharmacy itself, we just know it's not a store. We are not just storing medications. We want to follow up on any kind of side effects, collecting reports, collecting alerts to make sure that these medications are safe and effective at the same time. We have also a big operating challenge in our hospitals, I think, given that most of these biosimilars nowadays we only focusing on immunogenicity, serious side effects, but when you come to efficacy, it may take a long time to discover or understand that the efficacy is not as equal as the originator. And this one, I think, should come from the pharmacy as the owner of the medication, and then working parallelly with all the medical departments. I would like to highlight a very important point, that our BNT committees should not only study requests that come officially to the BNT. We want to act proactively to see what's in the market there, even if there is no request coming from a medical department or from a consultant. We need to also understand if there is a good candidate medication that can replace a medication in the formulary, and at the same time, instead of having like 100 patients with this allocated budget, we can have 200 or 300 patients treated with the same medication, with the same efficacy, and with the same safety profile. These are the major challenges that we have, and we usually try to work on to avoid, or like to make our experience with biosimilars better.
Perfect. يعطيك العافية. Thank you very much, Dr. Abdulaziz. I'm going to open a question for all the panelists here. In terms of adoption, we've seen the European were ahead of the game, and we talked about the Canadian experience, and we also probably heard of the US experience. So how about here in the Saudi experience? What do you guys think are the adoption barriers here? Can we identify any adoption barriers among our institutions, and how do we overcome these barriers? So this is a question for everybody. You can just raise your hand if you want to participate. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think some of the adoption barriers have already been alluded to already during the course of the discussions. One obvious one is healthcare professionals, how healthcare professionals, especially prescribers, whether or not they feel comfortable with biosimilars. You can get over that in some ways by involving them from the beginning, as we heard during the presentation, of the actual process itself, so that they are involved and they're working as part of the group in order to try and adopt the biosimilars. The other potential barrier, which I think, again, as was presented during the presentation in the Canadian experience, is what approach do you take? Do you switch completely so that you only have the biosimilar available, or do you take the Canadian approach where that there was, the presentation that was given, that you keep the originator, but any new patient will go on the biosimilar? And I think there's pros and cons for both of those approaches, but I think that in itself, trying to make that decision is also a potential barrier to adopting a biosimilar. And the one that's already been mentioned was the cost. Like I said, I think one of the things at an institutional level is that, as you've seen, there's a lot of work that needs to go into biosimilars once you adopt them. So there's the education process and making sure that supply is always available and so on. So those things are quite labor intensive. Are those things worth it if the cost isn't massively different? A good example is recently in our biological group, we looked at insulin Basalgard, and we didn't find a massive difference between Basalgard, which is insulin glargine, to Lantus, which is the originator product. So in the end, we decided not to switch completely, because that would require a huge amount of effort and work to try and educate the patients. We've got so many patients on the insulin glargine already. So these are kind of the issues that I think people will face when trying to adopt biosimilars.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mohammed. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
If you allow me. يعني a very nice discussion, and I have 2 points. طبعا يعني we almost have a universal agreement that there is a benefit in moving toward cost efficiency, whether it's actually biosimilar or generic or so on. لكن للأسف الإنسان دائما عدو ما يجهل. يعني we're lacking a lot of knowledge in terms of where we're trying to get. Clear strategic planning into where do we want to be in a year from now. يعني محمد الله يدير عافية, he just mentioned a very important thing, اللي هو interchangeability. Do we want to have one product completely replaced by a previous product will, this is too far to ask in the next few weeks. And I can tell you a lot of people will call Dr. عبد العزيز وحيكونوا زعلانين جدا منه في الجامعة إنه كيف تغير التغيير هذا المباشر القوي جدا. Maybe we have to have a plan. In 5 years' time, we should be at a place where we are very comfortable all the way to interchangeability. Like we need to start the process as soon as possible. Education. Very few physicians, by the way, and I speak on behalf of physicians, are well informed about the concept of health economy and pharmaceutical definition of biosimilar or generic or even biologics, to say the truth. For those things are actually very important, and knowledge in this area is lacking, and we face it every day. And sometimes it's easy to speak to a pharmacist about a new drug than to speak to one of your colleagues about why don't we just move to GCSF was very difficult to start with, and it's actually a very simple biosimilar to be used and not too much side effect to anticipate. لكن برضو هذه كان فيها a lot of discussion between physicians and pharmacists. I think it's strategic planning into where do you want to be from here into 5 years. Barrier of education, availability, and what to bring and what not. وصراحة أنا عجبني السجستشن حق دكتور عبد العزيز إنه why don't we just rather than wait for request إنه يكون عندنا visual committee that looks at what's available and suggest it to a central committee مثلا الدكتورة هاجر إنه those are actually very decent biosimilar available. Why don't you just look into them? هذه بعض الأفكار الجميلة.
Thank you, Dr. Hani. I echo you with the two more points. We are now implementing registries that will be, inshallah, national registries in the Saudi Health Council. We're building registries in immunology, and we do have some items in COPD, respiratory, and diabetes. So having these really real-world data that shows us when we had the originator versus the introduction of the biosimilars into our hospitals, and see the patients and the endpoints and how this reflects on an evidence-based data reflecting our patients. So this is very important, and we're working on it. In regards to scanning the new medications, or if we should not wait for a request. In our central committee, as you were part of it, we do a class review on the indication or in the therapeutic class itself. So we link all medications, whether they were a biologics or a biosimilar, into this class review, and we are implementing a budget impact, as one of them was the psoriasis, and now we are working on the RA, and adding all medications, again, whether they were a biologic or biosimilar, into the same model, and to make it very clear for the stakeholders, adding these medications, whether in an economic impact or even in the safety and efficacy, will be very clear for all stakeholders. Thank you.
Excellent. يعطيك العافية هاجر. I would like to thank all the panelists. This is a great and exciting discussion. I personally learned a lot from different sectors and different institutions. This will conclude our panel discussion. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. And I'll leave it to Dr. Nora.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this panel discussion. I felt the time is really short. I don't know if it's just me, but I really enjoyed the conversation and I enjoyed the perspective of everyone and the questions too. Maybe we can do it more and hear about different sectors and different people, also including non-oncology, not only oncology, in the biosimilars discussion. I think it's really important too. So thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you to Dr. Tang for being part of the scientific committee. She thankfully accepted our invitation in a short period of time, and she was able to review all our scientific material and communicating with Dr. Majid and me on this important topic. We are more than happy to hear from the panelists and all the attendees, their feedback and their opinion about the meeting. Also, if they are requesting any other types of meetings or any other specific types of panel discussions and so on, we're more than happy to have all of those conducted via SOPA. Hope you had a very pleasant and positive experience with this, and we are really thankful for your time. So by that, we conclude our session today, and thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Frank and Alicia.